Hi, I'm Maggie.
And I'm Marin, and you're listening to Tell Me I'm Sorry, a podcast where we deconstruct and muse on depictions of girlhood in film, literature, and other media.
A feminist celebration of pop culture, the audacity of youth, and the ways we grow away from and into our bodies, beliefs, and dreams for ourselves and each other. Today we're discussing
Romeo and Juliet. Directed by Baz Luhrmann. Sorry, I'm trying to compose myself because I'm so excited. And whenever I've seen you in the last 2 weeks, I've had to really rein myself in from discussing this movie, and I'm trying to downplay how excited I am.
Okay.
Because I'm so excited. Romeo and Juliet, directed by Baz Luhrmann, who has also directed the films Strictly Ballroom, Moulin Rouge, Australia, The Great Gatsby, and Elvis. Maggie, have you seen any of those films?
Yes. Moulin Rouge and The Great Gatsby.
Okay.
Yes.
I've seen both of those as well, and I saw Elvis. And The Great Gatsby was a very seminal film for me because I was like 13. It was the summer before 8th grade, and it just blew my mind because it was so over the top. Written by Craig Pearce and Baz Luhrmann, who collaborate pretty much on all of Baz Luhrmann's films. However, it's worth noting that the script for this film relies on Shakespeare's original dialogue, but the script obviously includes original scene staging. This film was released November 1st, 1996, and the poster tagline is, "My only love sprung from my only hate," which is, of course, lifted directly from the play. Maggie, do you have thoughts on that tagline? You did a gesture.
Oh, I like that line in general.
Good.
And I always really point it out to my students. And then they like to say it 100 times in very dramatic ways.
Okay.
So, yeah.
According to Google, their synopsis for this film goes as follows. In this screen adaptation of the classic Shakespearean romantic tragedy, the setting is updated to a postmodern city named Verona Beach. In this version, the Capulets and the Montagues are two rival gangs. Juliet, Claire Danes, is attending a costume ball thrown by her parents. Her father, Fulgencio Capulet, Paul Sorvino, has arranged her marriage to the boorish Paris, Paul Rudd, as part of a strategic investment plan. Romeo, Leonardo DiCaprio, attends the masked ball, and he and Juliet fall in love. I find it interesting that synopsis contains a sentence dedicated to this alleged business deal. Yeah. Because I feel like that only gets one sentence in the whole movie.
Yeah. Okay, I was thinking the same thing as you were reading that. I was like, I'm going to be honest, I don't even think I realized that it was meant to. Because that wasn't a part of Romeo and Juliet.
Because in the original play, it's just, you just want to get your daughter married off as soon as possible. Before we dive into discussing the film, specific scenes and whatnot, I'm going to give what I've called my frenzied under 60 seconds plot summary. Just for those of you who have never read Romeo and Juliet, or it's just been a really long time since you were in 9th grade literature class where you were supposed to have read it and maybe you didn't actually, whatever, just to make sure we're all on the same page. So this is my very not polished description of Romeo and Juliet. We open public brawl between the Capulets and the Montagues. Romeo, who is a Montague, is emo because a girl named Rosaline doesn't love him. Benvolio, his cousin, wants him to find a new love. Mercutio, who is Romeo's best friend, gets an invitation to the Capulets' masked ball. Juliet's parents want her to marry Paris, who is on the cover of Time magazine. At the ball, Romeo and Juliet stare at each other through a fish tank, and it's transcendent. They declare their love despite their warring families, and a priest marries them the next day. Tybalt, Juliet's cousin, wants to kill Romeo for sneaking into the ball and instead kills Mercutio, and Romeo kills Tybalt in retaliation. Romeo gets exiled from the city, and Juliet's parents tell her she's going to marry Paris on Thursday! ! Juliet plans to fake her suicide by taking sleeping potion and then running away with Romeo after she wakes up. Romeo hears of her quote-unquote death and, overcome with grief because he doesn't know that it's a fake death, poisons himself. And after Romeo dies, Juliet then kills herself, and the two families decide to end their feud. And that is all you need to know about Romeo and Juliet. Maggie, now I have to ask you a very important question, which is, what is your Romeo and Juliet origin story?
Oh my gosh. I'm going to be honest. I don't know if I have one. I've thought about it so much, but I just grew up in the 90s, and like at some point I saw this movie. It was Leonardo DiCaprio, Claire Danes. It's your quintessential 90s film in the most beautiful. That is honestly, it's very timely. And so it's almost more fun to watch it now looking back. Yeah. I feel like almost this heartbreak. It's almost heartbreakingly nostalgic for me.
I see.
And so I know when I did see it, I was quite young. I didn't see it right when it came out, but I probably was like 10. That was definitely my first introduction to Shakespeare's language, for sure. Mm-hmm. I knew that it was beautiful, but I didn't understand what really they were saying. But I could see what was happening, which was enough, especially with Leo DiCaprio and Claire Danes.
Oh,
it was good.
Oh, angelic. They're so angelic and beautiful, and I will... Did you have any more you wanted to add?
No.
Before I... Okay. Mm-hmm. My origin story for this movie. I did not watch this movie for the first time until 2 weeks ago.
I didn't know you hadn't seen it before.
No, I hadn't.
Oh my God.
I don't know how I hadn't ever seen it, because I don't know how I went 25 years without seeing it.
I'm so happy for you.
Thank you. No. I'm so happy for me too. And so I just want to say, in order to set the tone for my forthcoming contributions to this conversation, that sometimes you start watching a film and you know within a few minutes that your entire fucking life is changing.
Oh my God.
And you know this because every cell in your body feels so alive, and you suddenly understand what all those ancient mystics were talking about when they went into the woods and saw God, because you're like, oh, that's what's happening to me right now as I'm watching this gorgeous, delirious, youthful, exuberant, deeply tragic film. Mm-hmm. Truly, within the first 10 minutes, I was like, oh, so this is an all-time Marin movie now. In my canon of films, I'm like, oh, okay. We've just stumbled on a new all-timer.
It's so fucking good.
Ever since I watched this movie, I've just been sustained by the fact that eventually we would get to talk about it. And I've just been a live wire for 2 weeks now. It's like weird. Anyways.
I'm so happy for you. Oh my God.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks. Wow. I expected to like it because I really dig Moulin Rouge. Like I said earlier, The Great Gatsby, Baz Luhrmann's adaptation of The Great Gatsby, was a very influential movie for me in terms of just realizing, oh, this is what you can do when you're making a movie. Mm-hmm. Some people hate his movies because they find the aesthetic of them very annoying and garish, and I can understand if you had photosensitivity issues. Watching one of his movies might not be the best thing for you, but generally I'm a Baz Luhrmann apologist / fan, so I don't know why I was so shocked at how much I fucking love this movie.
Well, and just you using those adjectives, garish and annoying, let's be honest, in a loving way, William Shakespeare's plays are garish and annoying. I mean, 90% of the audience, Shakespeare's audience, or people at the time in general, were illiterate. They wanted to be entertained. If they wanted to even learn about the world, that's part of the reason why Shakespeare wrote so many histories, right? Because people went to his plays to learn and to laugh and for the same reasons we go to the movies. We don't necessarily go there to learn, right? Literacy rates are much higher. We can access information in other ways now.
And also, speaking of people possibly thinking that Baz Luhrmann's aesthetic sensibilities are garish or annoying, I would like to start by talking about the aesthetic of this movie. Because as I was watching it, I realized if you pause pretty much any frame of this movie and just take in what is happening on the screen, what's happening in the foreground, what's happening in the background, pretty much any frame of this movie looks like a page that could be in J14 magazine or Tiger Beat or any other of those celebrity magazines targeted at tween girls. Or any shot of this movie looks like a collage I would have made when I was 14 years old. And I was like, oh, so this movie, it is depicting girlhood in the Juliet character. But even more than that, I was watching it and I was like, this movie feels like it's made for girlhood. So much of its visual language feels aligned with these visuals that we associate with media made for girls and by girls. And I really love that.
I had not considered that, so now I'm just considering it. I would agree with that. I think that when I was watching it, I was thinking about this idea of these spaces being collaged. Mm-hmm. I think that's something that's done so well in this film is how Verona and the community of Verona and the violence of the city itself is always like encroaching each scene. And I think so like the collage nature of that, I think that's a really good word to describe what is happening. Because you don't get that in a lot of other versions of Romeo and Juliet. No. To me, the point of Romeo and Juliet is about violence and asking questions about who is responsible for the violence that we inflict on each other and who gets to decide when it's justified. And truly, I think that those are the questions that Shakespeare really wanted us asking. But those questions alone aren't going to get people's attention as much as throwing in a tragic love story between two beautiful people.
Yes.
Right?
I agree with all of that. And the other thing I wanted to say about this collage-y aesthetic and the way it's edited, and like when you were talking about how quintessentially 90s this movie is, I just thought of MTV reality TV shows with how the locations show up and they're like Mercutio, Romeo's friend. And I was like, oh, it feels like I'm watching an MTV reality show. I use the word bombasticness in my notes, which I use that word with love. It sets this tone and this precedent for grandness, which some people would argue is style without substance. However, I could not disagree more because I think that precedent for grandness, what it does and what it does so well and so movingly is it gives way to this uninhibited, undiluted emotion portrayed by these teenage characters. And so in that sense, I'm truly blown away by the ways in which this film, I think, honors the feelings of its young characters. It feels remarkable to me. It feels often ahead of its time. It feels like a refutation of the ways in which our culture frequently demeans the quote-unquote excessive feelings of teenagers, specifically girls. But I think there's some interesting stuff happening with gender here, which we can talk about later. I'm just in awe of the way that the aesthetic and the emotional are working together in this movie.
Talking about the diminishment of just feelings and their impact on the world. The scene that immediately came to mind is right away in the beginning, right? We have the Montagues, we have the Capulets, they have that fight at the gas station. Right. Iconic. They have this fight at the gas station. And after that, we get this, again, like this collage of how that violence is rippled throughout the entire city. And so to me, that's saying, oh, teenage love doesn't matter. Well, here we have two families feuding against each other for no fucking reason.
Never learn why.
And then they expect, for some reason, the teenage members of the family to figure their shit out. And to not translate that feud into violence.
Right, because all of the violence is enacted by the children. The precedent for violence is set by the parents. The children are acting this way because the parents have told them, you hate that family. If they even so much as look at you a certain way, you kill them. So the kids are enacting all of this violence that their parents have essentially trained them to enact. The other thing that really struck me with the opening scene at the gas station Then there's that montage of it reverberating through the city. And then you meet Romeo for the first time. You see Romeo for the first time. So this opening brawl, which does affect the outcomes at the end of the movie, Romeo and Juliet aren't even there for it. Because when you first see Romeo, he's just chilling by himself on the beach and he's sad because Rosaline doesn't love him. And I also just have to say, I think this was the moment that I was like, oh, okay, this movie is very special because you can't even really see his face because he's lit from behind with this brilliant, just orange light. And there's Radiohead playing in the background. And at that moment, I thought to myself, oh, this movie has a female gaze. And I just thought that on the fly. And I was like, well, obviously, Baz Luhrmann is not a woman. And I was like, what do I mean by this movie has a female gaze? And I was thinking about it, and I was reading about how different film theorists have described the female gaze, and I found this quote from an article, which was actually published in a fashion magazine run by undergraduates at, I believe, the University of Missouri. So I would like to read it to you, and then perhaps hear you respond. This is what Alexis Loftus of Sartorial magazine says about the female gaze. Characters viewed through the lens of the female gaze are not caricatures. The beauty of the female gaze is that it aims to empathize rather than objectify, to show emotion and intimacy while also showing respect. The female gaze endeavors to see masculinity in non-traditional ways and shows that femininity is something we should all embrace.
I like that definition.
I do too.
I feel like part of that can be attributed to, and this is, I just feel like I sound like such a fucking English teacher in a second, but I feel like a part of that can be attributed to William Shakespeare, like the play itself calls for that kind of comparison by creating like a foil of Romeo and Mercutio, and even just that scene where we have the Montagues and Capulets fighting, then the next scene is Romeo writing in his journal. The piece of that, Benvolio moving back and forth between those spaces. He's like a peacemaker sort of character, and how those are playing at odds with each other, and how Leonardo DiCaprio's Romeo. When I watch this movie, I'm like 10 years old again. Like seeing 21-year-old Leonardo DiCaprio for the first time, and it's breathtaking.
It is. It is.
I mean, he's no Heath Ledger. He'll never be Heath Ledger, but he was doing all right.
I saw his face for the first time and the way he was lit and with the moody music, and he's reciting poetry and writing in his journal. I was like, oh my God, I'm 10 years old again. Like you said. And then I was rewatching scenes on YouTube. I was rewatching the scene where you're introduced to his character for the first time. And one of the top comments on the YouTube video was someone recounting a memory of watching this adaptation in high school English. And they were like, when you saw Leo's face for the first time, all the girls just, you could just feel it in the room. And the person said that their teacher laughed and was like, yeah, that happens every year. This movie understands the pleasure that it's bringing to a specific demographic, possibly. And we should all bask in the beauty of young Leo's floppy-haired androgyny. But I'm like, that feels pretty fucking cool. That we're gonna frame him in this beautiful, soft way that doesn't feel like it's objectifying him, but it is still invoking the pleasure and excitement of young girls or young boys or anyone of any age, gender, orientation. We're just invited to bask in the beauty.
And I think that this idea of the female gaze is also evident in the fact that I do not think we get that same kind of attention to Claire Danes as a physical apparition. She gets to be, in many ways, I would argue, she gets to be a girl in this movie. She gets to be 13 years old, just in love with this beautiful boy. It feels youthful.
Yes.
Feels like a real, a girlhood, if you will.
I have a whole section in my notes where the heading is just tenderness towards children. That was what I was most struck by, is how even though this is a play that has like notoriously one of the cruelest endings ever because it's two children killing themselves, so much of the movie I think extends so much kindness towards them. And I feel like that's really exemplified in the scene where Romeo and Juliet see each other for the first time, which I was just unprepared for how good this scene is. They're at this ball, and our entry to it is Romeo's point of view, and he's just wandered off by himself and he's looking at this fish tank. And then Juliet's on the other side of the fish tank, and so they lock eyes through the glass. Mm-hmm. And there's these beautiful fish, and we'll talk about the song in a minute because I have a whole thing about it. But when I was watching that scene, I was weeping. And the reason I was crying is because it's so playful and joyful. When they lock eyes and they look at each other, it's not intense or smoldering or self-serious, but they're excited. And I think my favorite part of the scene is when Romeo sees Juliet and he, for half a second, he raises his eyebrows and he looks like such a kid. And I can just hear him in his head being like, whoa. And he smashes his nose against the glass, and then she smiles back, and there's just curiosity lit up in her face, and you're just in that moment with them. And I can't emphasize enough just how much you feel like a kid. Even though the movie is kind of playing up this youthful joy, it's also taking the moment seriously because it's like, this is what it is to be this kid falling in love for the first time. Mm-hmm. And so I think the fact that it just treats them with depth is so, I just wasn't expecting that, and it feels really important, and it feels like a rarity.
I also have some notes on the care that's taken to have a conversation about childhood or even just childishness. Mm-hmm. I know I keep going back to the first scene, but it's just so good. The first scene is just so good. They have a gunfight, by the way. Like, they're using guns, which, to be fair, in Shakespeare's time, in that first scene, the swords they would have been using would have been the equivalent of a bunch of men walking in with a bunch of guns. We have the Capulets and we have the Montagues, and they keep singing this song. I'm a pretty piece of flesh. I can't remember how. And it's a line from the play, but it's also a song. And they're listening to that song later on in the movie as well. So they're just acting very childish, just like yelling at people on the street, just being super douchey. They're children. Yeah. And then they get to the gas station. Tybalt, a Capulet, I think he actually comes out of the gas station door, or he gets out of a car. I don't remember where exactly he comes from, but what I do remember is he's standing like in front of the door to the gas station, and there's a child starts walking out, and Tybalt, without thinking, points the gun at the child. And so right away, you have all of this violence. And for me, though, that really highlighted the fact that, yes, he's pointing this gun at a child, but he is also, in many ways, a child. Like, these boys are meant to be very young, which isn't as evident in the film as it is in the play itself. If you have the context for the play. It's basically a bunch of teenagers street fighting, which was a problem. Like, Elizabethan street fighting was a thing. Men were fighting in the streets all of the time. And 90% of the violence was enacted by men. 80% of their victims were also men. And there was this expectation that you are violent. Mm-hmm. But there's also this expectation that you back down from that violence first to show, oh, there's nothing else I could do. Mm. So if it came down to somebody making a call, like the Prince of Verona being like, who started this? Mm-hmm. Was there anything else you could do? Right. Why did you do this? They could be like, I did whatever I could. Yeah. I backed down first, you know? So there's just like these children running through the streets with guns and or knives in their, or swords, right, in the original, fueled by, like we already talked about, their parents' hate. And then I don't know, I can't get over the fact that we are expecting them to act right, which is so crushingly relatable and relevant to what is happening in our world now.
Yeah. There is like an eerie pall hanging over.
Yes. The tenderness of childhood and also the vulnerability of that.
Because the other thing that I wanted to mention is that, because common complaint that gets levied against Romeo and Juliet, especially by, I guess, modern audiences, is they're like, it's just not realistic that these two kids would fall in love this fast and risk it all over 2 days and then kill themselves. What? I don't know why I've adopted this voice.
That's what they're sounding like, yeah.
But I think the way the opening scene is staged at the gas station and the way we are so quickly dropped into this violence and we understand the stakes of this violence, and it's clearly established that these are children who are fighting, it contextualizes the rashness of Romeo and Juliet's love so well. Because when you establish these violent stakes in the opening scene and you show us this world where everyone is so quick to violence and that's all you've ever known, then of course the flip side of that is you're gonna be inclined to be quick to love. It's the only way to ensure that you have it is if you grab it the second you can. And so I think within the context of the play and the historical setting within which the play was originally written, that works really well. But I think it also speaks more broadly to just being a teenager where everything, your world is so small and the smallest thing can feel like the end of the world. And so when you suddenly stumble onto something when you're 14 that you think is good, you're going to chase after it with so much conviction. And so I can imagine a lot of 16-year-olds were watching this movie in 96 in the theaters and really gravitating towards the film's depiction of that. And it feels really smart. And again, it just feels very kind to this specific demographic of people who was going to be watching the film.
Because also, I stand by the fact that when I was a teenager, I would totally fall in love and run away and marry somebody after knowing them for 15 seconds.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I would. Like, those feelings are so strong. Even as an adult. Even as an adult, I have made decisions about who to love very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And it's had consequences. And sometimes those consequences are really good, right? My partner now, we moved very quickly, and now it's been 5 years, and that worked out for me. So I guess I just agree that the movie does a good job at letting their love feel meaningful.
And the other thing too is that this movie highlights really well how neglected these kids are. Because this is what I love about Shakespeare. And this is true for any literature, but I can say this play is about X, and Maggie can say this play is about X, and her X can be entirely different than mine. So what you were saying earlier about this play is about violence, I really feel like this play is about what happens when we neglect our children. After Romeo and Juliet see each other and they're falling in love and they're running off and they're kissing, and their kisses are so urgent and sloppy, and just I'm like, yeah, this is how teenagers kiss, and I just, oh, it's so good. But once Romeo sees Juliet whisked off by her parents and his face falls and he says, is she a Capulet? And it's so devastating because he realizes the stakes of this intergenerational violence, and the sinking feeling that he's having, it really doesn't feel that different than when I was in 5th grade in this tiny Catholic school and there were like 30 kids in my grade, and I found out that my crush liked someone else, you know, because their world is so small and volatile in a way that I just think a lot of children can relate to. And so the fact that they have fallen in love with each other and they don't have the guidance of their parents to navigate what it's like to fall in love and have your heart broken for the first time, it's so devastating to watch because it's so isolating to have to hide who you are from your parents. And in this case, we see the most tragic outcome possible of that, which is that both of these children die because they felt like they had to hide who they were from their parents. And I think, again, lots of adolescents can watch that and relate to that in all kinds of different ways, whether it's because you have a crush on someone who the powers that be in middle school have deemed a loser, or because you have a crush on someone that agresses our heteronormative boundaries and you feel like you can't be open about that with a trusted adult. That the way the film is adapted is using Shakespeare's text to speak to, I think, so many anxieties that adolescents have. There, that's the end of that monologue. There will be more.
As much as the play is about what I...
Right, and I'm not saying it is about violence.
About,
you know, it's about
humanity. It's just it's a very human play.
It is.
It's very human.
The two adults that Romeo and Juliet can trust in their life. Juliet trusts her nurse, and Romeo trusts Father Lawrence, who's the local priest. And he's begging Father Lawrence to marry them. And ultimately what gets Father Lawrence to agree is he's like, oh, maybe if you two get married and can show the world how strong your love is, then it'll end this feud that has been terrorizing our community for God knows how long. And so it's like, why are we putting that onus on literal children? And we still do that. And that goes back to this idea of these children who are guided for the most part by their parents or other adults in their lives. And it just made me so sad.
Something that is frustrating about the conversation between Lord Capulet and Paris that we get is that initially he's like, no, she's too young.
Yeah.
And then Paris is like, but what if she likes me? And then he's like, well, yeah, I guess if she likes you. So in this sense, he's decided that she has the agency to fall in love with somebody who he approves of, though. So it's a false autonomy. He's providing her like this false sense of autonomy. She doesn't really have it.
Yeah.
And I think that the expectations that we have for adolescents are unclear.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
The hypocritical, usually.
Yeah, because then whatever semblance of autonomy he thought he was giving her, he just fully rescinds at the end of the movie, which I was struck by how when there's that confrontation between Juliet and her father, where he's like, you will marry Paris tomorrow. If not, you're going to live on the street and you will not be my daughter anymore. That scene is really hard to watch because they really play up his anger and his violence towards her. I'm pretty sure he also slaps his wife on the face. I could be misremembering though.
I can't remember exactly.
But
it's very violent scene.
But it's really violent. And even though she's not out fighting in the streets, like in her, what is supposed to be her safe domestic sphere, there is still heaps of violence put upon her. In that sense, her marriage to Romeo does represent freedom because it's her abandoning that as free as you can be when you're 13 and married. Does that make sense?
It really does. And in addition to that, this message that she's not old enough to make her own decision, but she's old enough to be married.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? And stacking up the subjugation of women oftentimes in these sort of scenarios where you're expected to marry somebody. Her mother also had Juliet at probably 14.
Yeah.
We learned that in the beginning too. And so it's just a cycle. So her mother has this expectation for Juliet because it was what was expected of her. I get the sense that the mother in some ways wants Juliet to have to get married young because she had to get married young. And there's obviously a level of resentment the mother would feel if Juliet had got to live this life that she never got to live. And we already know that Juliet's mother is pretty ineffectual as far as being a parent goes. She really relies on the nurse to take care of Juliet. But I feel like that is an element that goes overlooked in this play, which of course Juliet's mother maybe feels resentment towards Juliet because having Juliet took away her ability to have a fucking life. Not that everybody who has a child at 14 feels that way, but given the time period and the situation, I do not think that that is a choice Juliet's mother would have made for herself.
I agree. And I hadn't thought about that, which is just proving your point in that how it's often overlooked and that you're just now bringing this to my attention. Look at you. The best teacher I ever had. The other thing I want to say is Claire Danes throughout her career has sort of developed a reputation as one of the greatest on-screen criers ever.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. And so after she has that very violent confrontation with her dad, and she's crying, and she says, "I long to die," it's hard to look at because it just feels so real. And even though it's so difficult to watch and it's so painful, it feels like there's an undercurrent of tenderness in the decision to really lean into that rawness and vulnerability. Because what I take as the bottom line of this adaptation is that children's joy is real joy, and taking that joy away from children causes real pain, sometimes so much so that they want to die.
Yeah, I mean, think of just how much weight we give to people experiencing something like divorce.
Mm-hmm.
And we allow them to talk about it as a kind of death,
Yeah.
as a kind of grieving.
Mm-hmm.
For a 14-year-old, breaking up with your partner of 2 weeks fucking feels the same. Feels the same. Because also that 2 weeks, in relation to the time that they've been alive,
Mm-hmm.
like the 2 weeks is a lot longer to them, right?
Yeah.
Than me at 35 years old.
Mm-hmm.
I've had very long relationships, but at 15, if I dated someone for 3 months, that was so much of my life. I was growing and changing so much. I think the last thing I really wanted to talk about is specifically about violence against like women
Mm-hmm.
in Romeo and Juliet. And something I heard on this podcast about Elizabeth and street fighting, and I guess we'll link it in the show notes. As part of the conversation, one of the interviewees brings up the fact that so much of the violence in Shakespeare's time, and this echoes into what we experience today, but the violence was happening on the street, meaning typically during the day. Like violence against men happens in broad daylight, and not always, obviously, but as a general rule of thumb, most of the violence that happens to women is happening behind closed doors or in the darkness.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess all of that to say that something else that often gets overlooked is that violence that Juliet experiences from her father. And also just like the violence of a world that expects her to get married and have a child when she is still a child.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a quieter kind of violence. She's not holding a sword
Right.
out in the street,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I just think that is another aspect of something else that this movie does really beautifully. I think about too how the fights are happening in the day, right? Out in public. But then also when Romeo and Juliet do kill themselves, it's in the darkness.
Yeah.
That violence is in the darkness, as well as when they first fall in love, it's at the party and then they're outside and it's nighttime and she's talking about the moon.
Yeah.
Right? I don't know. I don't have anything super profound to say about that. I just like the contrast.
It's technically this way in the play because Romeo poisons himself, and then in the play, Juliet stabs herself with a dagger. And so in the movie that we're discussing, the daggers are replaced with guns. So Romeo poisons himself and Juliet shoots herself with a gun. And so it has always felt very intentional that she takes her life with the weapon that the men have been using to fight in the streets.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like this patriarchal violence is inescapable. And so even though she was never once that we know of in a street fight, the street fight still came to her and destroyed her life and made her feel like she had no other options. And I think it's powerful that Shakespeare was depicting that in whatever year it was he wrote this play. Because unfortunately, it is still very relevant.
Right. I just want to say one more thing, because now I'm thinking she wouldn't have been allowed to go out and be a part of the violence. But when violence was being perpetrated against her, it was from someone that was supposed to protect her.
Right.
And so here's the thing too, that I feel like it's overlooked sometimes. You should not choose suicide, right? Obviously. Not a choice that I want anybody to make for themselves. But also it can be the result of like mental illness. So this question of died by suicide rather than having taken their own life when it, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm not dismissing that. In this instance, though, Juliet is responding to the world around her. she makes that decision because of the situation that she is in, which is that the man she loved, the young boy, really, that she loved, just killed himself. And now what is she supposed to do? Mm-hmm. Go home to her father, who just beat her, right? So what are her choices? And then marry a man she hardly knows?
Yeah, and her parents are not going to comfort her about the boy she loves being dead. Mm-hmm. Just like no one was there to comfort Romeo when he thought Juliet was dead. So he felt like he had to resort to suicide. Mm-hmm. Like, oh my... I'm going to cry just talking about it.
I think that we diminish their suicides to just, they were just two teenagers overreacting.
They were dramatic.
And that isn't true. They were actually responding very appropriately, I think, to the position that society put them in.
And I do want to talk briefly just about how...
I shouldn't say appropriately. I should say rationally. Do you know what I mean?
Yes. About the ways in which their deaths are staged. Because when you're just reading the play, the text, Romeo goes to the tomb. He thinks Juliet is dead. He kills himself. Juliet wakes up, sees that Romeo is dead, and then she actually kills herself for real. And the way they have staged it here is that Romeo goes to the tomb, sees her, is like, she's dead, drinks the poison. After he drinks the poison, but before it's taken effect, Juliet wakes up. And so he realizes that she is still alive. And she sees him die.
Mm-hmm. Fucking brutal. Yeah.
And I don't really have anything to analyze about it other than it is so brutal. But also in a way, again, to talk about this tension between the brutality and the kindness in this film, there's something that feels kind about it in that if this is how it had to end, at least they were alive together for 2 seconds one more time. Mm-hmm. You know, 2 details about that scene too that just broke me are when Romeo, before he drinks the poison and he's crying over her body, and the way he like wipes his tears, he uses like his whole hands to do it, and he just, again, he looks like such a little kid. And then after he has died and Juliet's crying, you just hear her sobs echoing because they're in this crypt. Mm-hmm. And it's just, there's just so many small details in this film that feel like a mix of wonderful, sensitive directing and acting choices and production design.
Really important detail also in that scene that they changed is that in the play, Romeo encounters Paris at the tomb and kills Paris.
Oh, right. Oh my gosh, I totally forgot
that part out.
They did.
I just want to go back because I'm thinking about using the word appropriate and then using the word rational, and I just want to talk about that a little bit more. I'm not saying that the decision to kill yourself is necessarily rational. I just want to emphasize that. Given the choices that society gave them, what they left them with, what were they supposed to do? Romeo killed Paris because that, first of all, he was defending himself, and also he was expected to act violently. And now Juliet wakes up, she sees not only Romeo dead in the original, in the actual play, Romeo dead and Paris dead. So every man in her life has either killed themselves, killed each other, or physically harmed her. What are her options? And these are the men that have control over what she's allowed to do. This essential question I ask my students all the time as we're reading this is violence ever justified? Who gets to make the decision whether or not it's justified? And who is responsible for that violence? That's the final question. Who is responsible for that violence? And I think in this case, it is obviously society.
Yeah.
I think that Romeo and his little cronies and the Capulets and Tybalt, I think all of them have been given a shitty fucking plot.
I like that you brought up Paris and the notion that inflicting violence upon Paris is what was expected of Romeo, because obviously Leonardo DiCaprio is one of the most famous actors in the world. He's a good actor. We all know this. But there are a lot of choices he makes in this movie that I felt very affected by. And I feel like it plays into what I was maybe saying earlier about, does this movie have a female gaze, and just the way this movie is approaching gender? Because Romeo cries so much in this movie. I don't think he cries at the beginning about Rosalind, but he's clearly very emotionally affected, and the movie lets him be in that space. Mm-hmm. And then when Mercutio dies, he's sobbing, and he's very tactile with Mercutio's body. He's just as tactile with it in terms of clutching it to him as he is when he's clutching what he thinks is Juliet's dead body. And Tybalt is upset that Romeo went to the Capulet ball. And so Tybalt challenges Romeo to a duel, and Romeo tries to diffuse the situation by being like, we are of the same family now. I want to choose familial love. Even when he is trying to choose love over violence, the circumstances don't let him. Mm-hmm. The refusal to fight is not always enough. And that is one of the most tragic things on this earth. So Tybalt kills Mercutio, and then in a fit of rage, Romeo goes after Tybalt and kills Tybalt. And after he kills Tybalt, the camera hangs so long on his face, and he's just weeping, and you are just seeing this boy realize he has become the thing he swore he wasn't going to become. And I know I sound like a broken record, but it is so devastating. But it also just feels so emotionally true that I can't help but also find it really moving. Mm-hmm. And even though this movie also shows Mercutio, you know, he's very comfortable with his gender expression and dressing in ways that are not what would typically be expected of him. When you get the sense he's very confident with himself. But then ultimately he too succumbs to the violence that's expected of him, because after Romeo refuses to fight Tybalt, what Mercutio says is calm, dishonorable submission. He takes offense to Romeo's submissiveness and his decision to not inflict violence. So then he gets embroiled in violence instead. Mm-hmm. And so I think this movie is presenting maleness in a lot of ways that we don't often see, in terms of Romeo's sensitivity and his crying, and obviously Mercutio's sexuality and gender expression, but while also at the same time showing how patriarchy is so damaging to our boys and our men, and is like one of the most heartbreaking things that we put them through.
Patriarchy hurts everyone.
I feel like we've gotten really somber, which is,
I mean, it's okay. A tragedy.
I know. And
it's Shakespeare.
I know. I have to talk about the song Kissing You by Desiree and that scene. I've already talked about the fish tank scene where Romeo and Juliet see each other for the first time. And it's a masterclass in how to stage and block a scene too, because the way the camera moves, there's very few cuts, and it's so good. So this goes back to my very first point about this movie's aesthetic feels like it's tailored to the sensibilities of teenage girls. And how fucking awesome is that? And I want to specifically zero in on the fish tank scene and the use of the song Kissing You, because what I love most about it, and this song is a god tier song, is that it's used diegetically in the scene. It's not just that the music is overlaid over the scene and audiences hear it. We get a shot of Desiree herself actually singing this song at the party. So it's what is playing in the background within the context of the scene. So as Romeo and Juliet are singing each other for the very first time, they are literally hearing this song in the background. And what I love so much about that choice, aside from its just obvious earnestness, which I'm pretty much always on board for, is that it exemplifies something I think teenage girls perhaps know better than anyone, which is that sometimes you hear a love/pop ballad one time and it changes your whole life.
That's so true.
And if I may, I have an intertextuality of sexy card to play here.
Go for it.
Which is that I can't talk about this song without talking about the show. I'm going to try really hard to not be coy and try to diminish my own excitement I can't talk about this song without talking about The Summer I Turned Pretty. Maggie's pursing her lips.
No, I'm excited to hear what you're going to say. I have never seen this, so I have no context.
Which is a teen drama, which is currently on air. Okay, the second season aired during the summer of 2023. A third season is coming. Okay, this show is huge. For people who don't know about it, the show is huge. The tweens and teens on TikTok, they love it. They love to argue about it. And I, as an adult who lives for the television antics of dramatic teens, also have a very soft spot in my heart for the show, as does my mother. And so I won't get into plot specifics, but if you really want to know my takes, because I have them, email us at tellmeimsorry@gmail.com. Because I will give you my opinions. But there is a scene in season 2 which uses this song, Kissing You by Desiree. And much like the scene in which it's used in Romeo and Juliet, this scene in The Summer I Turned Pretty is so achingly tender and full of youthful excitement and nervousness and discovery. And it is like teen television excellence. I cannot overstate this enough. And I found an interview with Jenny Han, who is the showrunner of The Summer I Turned Pretty and the author of the young adult book series upon which the show is based. If you're familiar with the series To All the Boys I Loved Before, she wrote those books too, which got made into a trilogy of films. And in this interview, she talks about being involved in the music selection process for the show and picking songs like Kissing You by Desiree as a way to connect with adult viewers who are not the show's teenage audience. Wow. So this is just a snippet of what she said. She said, when the first book in the trilogy was published in 2009, most of its readers were young tweens. Now they're in their 20s and 30s. I've said book girls are first in my heart, and I do mean that. I'm always thinking of them and wanting to really delight them with the show. And I want to talk about this and her very deliberate use of this song, simply to say, how lovely is it that Jenny Han, as a young person, which I looked it up, she would have been 16 or 17 when Romeo and Juliet was released in theaters, saw Romeo and Juliet and was affected by this scene and this song and held it so close to her that years later she would pay homage to it in her show, not only by using it in the show, but by using it in a scene which has the same tender essence as the scene in the original Romeo and Juliet. Because ultimately what she is doing is using the song as a backdrop for the celebration of adolescent love and discovery, and she's reminding adult audiences of their young selves and affirming how young audiences might be feeling currently. Before I say anything else, do you have a response to that? I just threw so much information at you.
I don't know if I have I am thinking about the idea. Okay, this is actually tangential. This is potentially tangential.
Go for it.
But it made me think about how historically, as a function in literature, allusions have
oh my god, this is literally my next paragraph.
Allusions have been elitist or Eurocentric. Is this like, okay, Marin's like shaking her head.
No,
sort of like excitement.
It's in an excited way because okay. Our brains are so synced right now.
Also male dominated, of course, because men dominated educational spheres where you would have access to learning about this shit that they're alluding to in other works of art. And it just feels good that women are reimagining what it means to allude to a work of what they consider to be art, what they consider to be this very poignant moment in their lives. Right? Yeah. Anyway.
Because, yeah, we often talk about how art is conversing with other art, but it's in this hyper academic way that often ignores the emotional experience of art as well. And it ignores, when we talk about illusion, we're not talking about commercially successful mainstream TV
Right.
targeted at teen girls. If we are going to talk about illusions in a TV show, we're talking about The Sopranos or something.
Right.
And so it feels very remarkable in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think it's a great thing. If Romeo and Juliet was making 16-year-old Jenny Han swoon or feel whatever she felt and inspiring her to grow up and create art that's making this new generation of teenage girls, but also anyone, she knows that there's grown women who are watching her show and making them swoon, then that's a wonderful thing to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just wanted to point out that connection that is happening between these two pieces of media, affirm that Romeo and Juliet has left its mark in our culture on so many people. And I think it's a testament to this film that it inspired another artist to honor it in her own way, while also more broadly honoring the adolescent experience.
Yeah, perfect. Marin did a mic drop motion.
It was really, really cringe.
No, I thought it was cool.
Maggie, what does this movie make you want to tell your younger self?
Oh my God. I mean, we're still pretty new at this,
Mm-hmm.
but why am I surprised that you asked this at the end of every episode? So, like,
In all fairness, I try not to think too hard about what my answer is going to be.
yeah.
I don't know why I want it to be on the fly, but I do.
I always tell myself at the end, I'm like, okay, for next time, be thinking about this as you're watching, and then I never do. So maybe it's good. I think it's good for it to just be very candid. I'm gonna have different thoughts as we're having this conversation.
Right, exactly.
Anyway, so what would I tell my younger self? Oh man, I mean, how do I say this? This is a complicated one for me because
Take your time.
I want to just say to her that when you feel something, especially love for another person, that is real, and don't let anyone diminish that. But I think in a lot of ways, I knew that. That's one thing I knew when I was a teenager. Like, for some reason, I understood that. And maybe it's the poet in me. Maybe it's just this very aggressively feeling, emoting machine that I am, that I've always been. At the same time, I've always been like very like anti-establishment, at least like in my mind. Because I knew that, though, that is part of what landed me in the situation I was in, which is when I was 17. I don't like using the word groom. It makes me feel uncomfortable every time I say it, but it is the most appropriate word to use. And part of my discomfort is that I know it makes other people uncomfortable, but it's just the fact of my life. Right. So sorry if that makes you uncomfortable, but this is a fact of my life, is that so when I was 17, I was groomed by a 32-year-old man. And then we were in a relationship for 9 years. And when people found out that we were together, I was like, well, my love is valid. I have these feelings. He has these feelings for me. So what is happening is okay, even if you don't understand it. I want to tell her that, but she already knew that. What she didn't know is that the world, though, and especially men, aren't going to protect you. I think she still had this expectation that the world had some kind of fucking responsibility to protect her, which is true. The world does have a responsibility to protect children and teenagers and women and everybody and men and fucking everybody, but it doesn't. It's very complicated for me. I would just tell her to listen to the women around her, I suppose. I think this one, because it's so complicated for me, I don't like my answer. I don't think that I can answer it appropriately. I feel like I can only respond to myself now, which is what would I tell myself right now in this moment?
Okay.
Which is a reminder that it's really important that I finish writing what I am writing about that experience, so that 17-year-old me, 16-year-old me, 15-year-old me would have had a story to read that looked like mine, because I truly didn't have one. I had Lolita, right?
Yeah.
Which obviously, terrible example of so many things. And that's sort of a cliche thing to say as a writer, but
No, it's not.
I think for especially women or other people who don't see their stories out in the world, that aren't a part of the canon traditionally, to write your story for yourself and for others, right? That come after you. That's all.
I think both answers were very well stated, I thought. I would tell myself, Okay, in the spirit of youthful tenderness and also my monologue about teen television, I'm gonna invoke Dawson's Creek to answer this question.
Nice. As you should.
Did I just spit on your face?
I don't think so.
Oh, okay. I thought I did. And I'm gonna invoke a scene from season 3, which, if you're a Dawson's Creek fan, you know season 3 is sacred text. Where one of the characters, who is a 16-year-old boy, admits to his brother, his older brother, that he is developing feelings for a girl, and he doesn't feel like he should be developing feelings for this girl because there are social implications to if he were to confess his feelings to her. And they're talking, and he tells his older brother, he says that she gives him butterflies. And the older brother is like, the older you get, the less often you experience those butterflies. You don't ever want to lose those. It's not very often someone will give you butterflies like that. And I always wrote this off because the whole, oh, he gives me butterflies, we just use it so much that it feels devoid of all meaning. Mm. And so, as much as I love Dawson's Creek, and I even love that scene, the whole butterflies portion of the conversation I was never super attuned to. But now I'm thinking about it. And I'm thinking about how I felt watching this movie for the first time, which was just 2 weeks ago. And I'm like, this movie gave me fucking butterflies. And so I would tell my younger self that maybe Deputy Doug was right and butterflies are rarer than we think they are. And it's not just people in a romantic context that can give them to you, right, but people in all kinds of contexts, that friendships are great romances, that a relationship to a piece of art that gives you butterflies is a great romance. And so I would just tell her, one day in 15 years, you're going to watch a movie that's going to give you butterflies. It's going to change your whole goddamn life. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. That makes the most sense I've ever heard something make. I understand completely. I love it. Yes.
Thank you. That's so sweet of you to say. So that is what I would tell her. And now it's my turn.
The announcement?
To reveal.
Oh my God, what is it?
What our next film is. We have made the decision going forward. The first few episodes we chose together what movie we were going to watch. But because Maggie and I, you know, we're different people. We have different tastes. We have different inclinations in the kinds of art that we want to experience. We have made the decision to take turns choosing what films we are going to watch and discuss. Mm-hmm. And we've decided, for our own entertainment and for your entertainment, that the person who gets to choose is going to reveal to the other on mic, so you can get their live reaction, and then you as the listener will know what the next episode is going to be about. Mm-hmm. So if you want to do some homework ahead of time and watch the film if you haven't seen it or whatever, you can. And so I won a coin toss and I got to pick our next film. And so, Maggie.
Why do I feel so nervous?
I don't know.
Why am I nervous?
I'm nervous too. We are jumping ahead to the summer of 2007. The number one song in the United States was Rihanna's Umbrella, and I was 8 years old, waiting to start the third grade. And I saw for the first time the movie Nancy Drew.
I've never seen this.
I figured, I didn't even know if you'd ever even heard of it, because it's a kids movie too. Like it's a, it's rated PG. There's no Leo wet in the pool making out with Claire Danes.
It's fine.
But it's Nancy Drew, girl sleuth, updated for the 21st century.
I'm excited. I read Nancy Drew books.
I did too, and I won't give away too much of my origin story, but this movie was big for me. I rewatched it just this past weekend, and it is a movie from 2007.
Dude, I'm so excited. No, I'm so excited. Okay, I am excited to watch this movie, and I'm so excited to do these reveals, because what a fucking wild ride we're about to take all of you guys on. Fucking wild. From Nancy Drew, I have a few movies in mind that I'm thinking, but it's gonna be like a hard left, and then Marin's gonna fucking swerve us the other way again. Yeah. I'm so excited.
It's ready.
Yeah. Great.
So, get ready. Buckle up. Nancy Drew, we're coming. Thank you so much for listening.